Okay, folks, so the video I'm recording today is to give us a bit of an introduction to how to do research through the library website. Now, you've already read the sort of basic guidelines that our librarian sent to you last week, but I hope this is a little bit more interactive and I can show you a few tricks for both speeding up the process and also what I think is the most important concept in learning to write these kind of research papers, which is how to filter information, because you're going to be confronted with a sort of unfamiliar system for doing the research to begin with, but also some of the terminology, the academic language that you're encountering is inevitably going to be a bit unfamiliar, but there are some sort of strategies for managing that and kind of keeping it under control. Now, here we are on the landing page for the Brooklyn College Library website, but I think what I want to do first is show you how I would go about this before I even, if I were in your position, before I even started looking for sources. So I'm going to bring up this notes app that I have, and what I've done essentially is kind of pretended like I was a student, and let's say that I decided that the short story collection that I chose was a George Saunders Pastoralia, which is the collection that includes the story that we read, The End of Firpo in the World. So here's a sort of like quick and dirty notes that I came up with that are largely based on what we discussed in class. Now, because my handwriting is terrible, it's also terrible on the iPad. So these general impressions, again, some of this is coming from me, but a lot of it is just the kind of consensus that we came to when we discussed the story in class. Now, this character Cody, who's the kid who dies in the bike accident, certainly seems to be a very angry kid, right? I mean, I think we all acknowledge that most of his sort of internal fantasies have to do with power dynamics, right? Fantasies of power and specifically of violence and revenge, right? So we have to keep that in mind when evaluating both him as an individual character, but also Saunders' kind of approach to how he writes character in general. I'm also pointing out here in the notes too, you can see what I've highlighted, that we have to keep in mind Cody's sort of physical disability, right? Which is never really defined, but it's alluded to by several of the characters, that the quote nose hole thing he has. So really there's more than one kind of thing going on with Cody. It's not just that he has a physical disability and that his home life is destabilized, but he obviously has kind of emotional problems that are a kind of reaction to this, by which I'm referring to his kind of unsavory way of like fantasizing about other people. And this kind of leads us into point 2 here, which is, okay, we acknowledge that Cody is a little bit of a jerk and that some of his sort of internal fixations are kind of borderline antisocial. I won't say sociopathic, because I don't think that's who Cody is, but they're disordered, to be sure. But the fact that Saunders writes from this character's perspective, the story is almost exclusively from his perspective, except for the last few lines when we realize that he's died. So we have to ask like this question of like, well, why does Saunders choose to write this story from his perspective? It sort of suggests that on some level, at least, Saunders as a writer has some empathy for this character. It's really difficult to write a short story or any length narrative from a character's perspective without developing some kind of empathy for the character. And we know this from, prestige television, like The Sopranos or Breaking Bad, things of this nature, the kind of anti-hero. I'm not totally sure that that's how I would classify Cody, but nevertheless, there is this fact that we can't escape from, that we're in his head, kind of whether we like it or not. And so that is a kind of starting point for some kind of empathy from Saunders' perspective anyway. And so here's where I ended on point 3. And I said this when we were discussing the argument essay, but I really do believe that every good essay, every good argument, research essay, what have you, really begins with a question. You might have already formulated a point that you want to make about what you're writing about, but I will consistently encourage you to begin with a question rather than a statement. And for me, anyway, the question about Saunders that I have, relating not just to this story, but really his work as a whole, is like what this larger project he has is. Why does he, not only in this story, but in many stories, why does he tend to write from the perspective of these sort of disenfranchised, marginalized characters who are not always the nicest people, but nevertheless find themselves in environments that kind of encourage them to react in the most disordered and antisocial ways possible? So, as I say here, why don't we see what a couple of scholars say about Saunders, just in general. So again, back to the library landing page. And I suggested this in the email that I sent you. It's not that I wouldn't go with the CUNY OneSearch or EBSCOhost or any of the other search functions that aggregate a lot of different databases. But for our particular purposes, especially with literary analysis, I would recommend going. So what I just clicked on there was all databases you see under the search bar. And I would, up here at the alphabetical kind of guide, I would go to J. And just as a first stop, I would visit this fourth hit here, JSTOR. Now it's asking me for my login. JSTOR is aggregates arts and humanities journals, and so again, it's not the only place I would look, but it's a good starting place that will filter out a lot of results from like STEM journals that are not going to be very relevant to us. Now, just to start with, I'm actually just going to put in George Saunders' name without any other qualifier, and of course, you know that you can add search boxes to get even more and more specific there. But for the moment, I'm just going to put in his name. But before I hit search, I'm going to scroll down and narrow by the item type because I only want to see articles. The reason why is that there might be some interesting content in like hard copy books in the library related to what you're searching for, but you're going to have a hell of a time getting to them right now because campus is shut down. That being said, many times there will be digital copies of those same BookLink works available through these databases, but just for the purposes of the video today, I'm going to stick with just searching for articles. So again, I've just put in Saunders' full name and said that I only want to see articles. So let's hit search and see what happens. Okay. This first one just says journal article George Saunders. It's from Bomb Magazine, which is a literary magazine. And so let's click through and see what it is. Okay, George Saunders by Sam Lipsyte. I've known George a little bit for a while now, etc., etc. We met at this hotel in New York for over 3 hours. They drank coffee. Okay, that is leading me to believe, and if you look at the second page, this is definitely an interview between the writer Sam Lipsyte and the writer George Saunders. So I'm not saying that these interviews, which you're going to find a lot of, especially with contemporary writers, are not useful for what we're doing, but they should not be our first visit. I would sort of mentally store this away, that there are a couple interviews that you could consult, but for our purposes at this stage, we're interested more in scholarly work on these writers. So let's go back. Now, the second one, A Conversation with George Saunders, also is an interview. But I want you to remember this name, Alex Miller, because even though I said don't start with the interviews, there's an important reason to come back to some of them. Okay, this Who Was George Saunders looks like it was published in 1892, so that's definitely not about the George Saunders that we're looking for. Now, this next hit, George Saunders and the Postmodern Working Class. Let's open this up and see. I'm actually going to download the PDF and open it in my PDF reader because it's easier for me to manipulate that way. Okay, so there's no abstract for this article, which is that little block of text you'll often see, especially in the sciences, that kind of gives you the sort of thumbnail sketch of really what an article is about. But I bet that if we focus in on this first couple paragraphs, we can get a sense of what this guy, David Rando, is talking about. For example, let's just look at this first sentence here. George Saunders peoples his stories with the losers of American history, the dispossessed, the oppressed, or merely those whom history's winners have walked all over on their path to glory, fame, or terrific wealth. Among other forms of marginalization, Saunders' subject is above all the American working class. Now, if we pull up our little preliminary notes, just kind of our gut feelings about Saunders' viewpoint, we didn't really say anything about class, about socioeconomic class or class position in society. We did, however, of course, use that word marginalized, right? And I think most of us agree that the character of Cody in that story is, marginalized, whether that's through his own actions or through things that are very much outside of his control. But Rando here is linking this idea of characters who are dispossessed or oppressed or marginalized with Saunders' concern with working class characters. If we look toward about the middle of this paragraph, Rando begins to kind of narrow his focus a little bit. He says this story, Sea Oak, from Pastoralia, which is the collection that the End of Firpo in the World is also in, is perhaps the most effective expression of Saunders' class constructions and representative of his approach to the formal representation of class. That might sound a little bit academic there, but I think all that Rando is really saying is that this one story, Sea Oak, from that same collection, is a really good example of how Saunders approaches writing about working class characters. Now, if we go down a little bit more, and I'm just picking up in these first couple pages things that might be relevant to what we've discussed so far. He says that Sea Oak provocatively suspends the techniques of realism and postmodernism in tense differential relation. Okay, leaving aside what he might mean by differential relation, I think we can look at the first part of this clause and say that this story, Sea Oak, suspends the techniques of realism. Now, we didn't read this story in class, but if you have picked Saunders to write about, you'll end up reading this story because it's in your chosen collection. Now, spoiler alert, in that story, there's this family living in this kind of small apartment together, very working class, kind of scraping by, and the grandmother, who works at the equivalent of a CVS, dies. But she doesn't just die, she actually comes back to life several days after she's buried as this kind of zombie who is haunting the family. So it's a very fantastical story in one aspect, but nevertheless there is some kind of commentary on social class and the economy going on throughout this story. This might not be as easy to see in the End of Firpo in the World, but I think there are a couple moments that, if we'll remember, are kind of gesturing in this direction. One of them is Cody's obsession with the neighbors, right? With the Dahlmeyers. So I'm just going to kind of zoom back in there because we listed this as, let's see what a couple of these scholars are saying. Well, the first truly academic article we found in our search is really putting this question of class out in front of us, socioeconomic class. Now, what that has to do with the End of Firpo in the World, I think, as I just mentioned, we would really do well to focus in on Cody's relationship with these neighbors who are quite a bit wealthier than his family is. They always have new sports equipment. He kind of fixates on their diving watches, etc., etc. And the fact that he realizes this difference really provokes certain, antisocial behaviors in him, right? He talks about different times when he sort of maliciously destroyed their sports equipment or hit their dog with a shovel, although he claims that's an accident, right? And if you'll remember, what he's doing on his little bike trip that day, he's actually on his way to their house to sabotage their sprinkler system, right? So yeah, if we zoom out a little bit, we can say the occasion for the telling of that tale is him on his way to perform some vandalism on his neighbor's house because he has this stored up resentment, largely mediated by their class differences, right? So what we know immediately from making this comparison is that we are not the only people out there who have picked up on this overarching trend in Saunders's work, right? I mean, this guy has written an 18-page essay about it. And let's search in this essay and see if he mentions our story. He doesn't. He doesn't mention the end of Firpo in the world. Let's see if he mentions Cody. He doesn't. And this is a good point to stop and emphasize something really important about this research process, which is it's not necessarily going to be the case that you find, just using the example from today, that you find an article that's about Saunders's work that definitely mentions the one story that we read in class. This essay certainly doesn't. But part of our job and part of the reason for assigning a research essay to begin with is to build these skills of kind of cross-referencing and comparing things to one another without there being a direct bright line between them. We've already done a little bit of that so far, saying that, okay, in this story Sea Oak, which we didn't read in class, but which is in that collection, there are some similar themes that we find in The End of Firpo in the world. And Rando, anyway, thinks that, like, this is indicative of the way in which Saunders sees, people in the working class and the way that he crafts narratives about them. So, yeah, if I were in the position of writing about Saunders's collection, this would be a very important essay to read. You may not end up reading it, cover to cover, as it were, but I would look for what seems relevant to your reading of the collection Pastoralia, and if you think that Rando's argument about Saunders' relationship with the working class holds water, or if it's something that seems to be consistent over, story after story, what kind of people is he writing about, and what seems to be the attitude of the story being told toward its own characters, which is really another way of saying, like, what is Saunders' attitude toward these characters? Whom does he seem to sympathize with? And if there is some kind of overarching moral to any of the stories, what does it seem to be? Okay, so let's look at those other hits that came up. Going back. Now, this second thing, after the interviews, which were not immediately relevant to us, we have this title, To Soften the Heart, George Saunders, Postmodern Satire and Empathy. Well, already in that title, this writer, Lane Nieper, is using a word that we've already used in our preliminary notes, right? And that point two, I said, despite Cody being kind of a jerk, Saunders obviously has some empathy for this character, since the story is told from his point of view. So this should be a good feeling, right? In your hunting down sources, that one of, like, the key words that we came up with is also, getting hits in these, like, scholarly databases. There's obviously enough scholars that think that empathy is one of the kind of primary orientations of Saunders's writing that it's worth writing articles about. Now, he uses two other terms in this title that it's going to be worth it to us to become, like, familiar with, right? And one of them is a word that was used in the previous article. And it's probably time in this process, if I were doing this research, to, like, face this and see if we can get kind of our hands around this idea. Both essays we've gotten hits thus far, have used this term postmodern, right? So Rando says that Saunders writes about, quote, the postmodern working class. And here this scholar Nieper is saying that George Saunders is engaging in a form of, like, postmodern satire. Now, I think that most of us are somewhat familiar with the idea of, like, whether or not a work is satire, or associated forms like parody. but it might be worth brushing up on just, the literary definition of satire and trying to understand why Nieper thinks that that's what Saunders is doing. Some of that to me seems pretty straightforward in that The End of Firpo in the World, which we read, is both a very funny story and also a very tragic story, right? I mean, the end of the story is literally this kid, bleeding out in the street from this bike accident, and he dies kind of in this access or this moment of self-loathing, right? In that sense, it's quite tragic. And yet the story also does have a sense of humor, right? From the language that Saunders uses, which is usually pretty interesting language. The way that Cody kind of talks to himself is very particular, kind of sounds like the way that a 13-year-old, engages with the world. And it's often like quite funny, even as I've said, even as it really arrives at a very tragic place. There's a goofiness, I think, to the story that is uniquely kind of like George Saunders. So let's look at what Nieper is saying here. So conveniently, this, I'm going to download the PDF so I can highlight it. So we're fortunate with this essay because it does have an abstract, right? It says, just the first line, George Saunders' postmodern fiction serves as the exemplar for early 21st century American satire's new attention to affect, to empathy, specifically in the example afforded by his short story collection, The 10th of December. So we should pause here and recognize that Nieper is not writing about the collection Pastoralia, which The End of Firpo in the World is in, but a later collection. Important sort of research principle. That does not mean that this is not useful to us. In fact, if the argument that we're making about Saunders' fiction is correct, these same sorts of themes and these same sorts of principles, if you want to call them that, principles of creating narrative, should really show up across all of Saunders' work. Not to say that artists don't occasionally deviate from their kind of basic script or basic orientation, but more often than not, you can tell that, like, okay, this is what a writer or an artist is concerned with. And rarely do these concerns change overwhelmingly over the course of a life or a career in creating art. So again, just because this essay is about a different collection doesn't mean that it's not going to be valuable to us as researchers. So if you look at the last line in this abstract, his fiction identifies vice and folly with withering exactitude. He does so in wildly imaginative and dramatic fictional worlds, but rather than stories ending with the emergence of some amorphous sense of correction, Saunders' stories instead propose the empathetic development of his audience. Okay. Now, there's some phrasing in that sentence that is a little bit abstruse, maybe is a little bit academic, but I think we can suss out basically what Nieper is saying, that on some level, Saunders' fiction, he says, proposes the empathetic development of his audience, which is an interesting claim because he's not just saying there that there's a moral to Saunders' stories or that Saunders takes a side and says that one character is, morally upstanding, whereas others are like corrupt or this, but that his stories, quote, instead propose the empathetic development of his audience. Now, it seems to me what Nieper is saying there is that these stories are intended to have a particular effect on us, not just one of, sentiment or feeling, but that, at least according to Nieper, that he thinks Saunders really is this larger project that I mentioned, right? Because we asked this question in the notes. What is Saunders' larger project, or what his point might be in presenting us with such a narrator? And Nieper thinks, well, absolutely, his project there is a kind of empathetic or moral development of the audience, that we're supposed to be somehow better people for having read this work by Saunders. It's an interesting claim, and a lot of people feel very differently about that. It was in vogue for a long time that, fiction shouldn't really take a side, that it should present, recognizable, like psychologically recognizable human beings, and it's really up to the reader to decide whether or not there's a moral component to the story. But Nieper seems to be suggesting here that it's definitely part of Saunders's project to take a stand on or one side or the other. And the question of like where we take that stand in relation to the end of Firpo in the world is an interesting one, because I think most of us agreed that Cody's kind of an unsavory character. But by the end of that story, after encountering like the Dahlmeyers, right, but also looking at, his parents, who seem like, they're struggling to get by themselves, but nevertheless, like, they don't treat him especially well all of the time, right? His stepdad, for example, coins this term for him, Firpo, which we don't know what that acronym stands for, but it seems fairly hostile, and it seems very derogatory of some things that Cody maybe can control and some things that he can't control. So I do think maybe that one of the things that Saunders is doing in that story is getting us to question, like, well, is Cody the asshole, or is it the system that has kind of created him in a way? And we might have different feelings on where we come down there, but I think it's a question worth asking. And I think it's absolutely a question that can be sharpened by trying to understand some of what Nieper is saying here. If in fact, George Saunders is engaging in postmodern satire, what is it that he is satirizing? What is the target of his sort of literary gifts there? Now let's look back at some other sources, right? Really, we've just looked at two sources so far. Interestingly, they seem to be using some of the same terminology. One seems to be writing about class, and one seems to be writing about the sort of more formal aspects of Saunders's work, like what it's intended to reveal and how it's structured. Then we have this third hit right here. Erring in the Direction of Kindness, George Saunders' compassionate interrogation of postmodern America. Now, I would encourage you to see some of the similarities between even just these two titles, right? This guy, Alex Miller, and Lane Nieper. So, I mean, we look at the kind of keywords in this first title. Postmodern is one of them, right? And empathy. Here we have erring in the direction of kindness, that word compassionate here. I think we can parallel that with some kind of empathy, right? And Miller goes even further than the first two writers here, talking about postmodern, which is something I don't think we should spend too long in this video talking about. But I do think that if one is writing about a writer like Saunders, that familiarizing yourself with like the basic concept of literary postmodernism is going to be important, because as we've seen, the first three real hits for like academic work on Saunders' work all mention this phrase, postmodern. So again, this article by Miller here, this erring in the direction of kindness, that he's kind of arguing that Saunders, he uses the phrase compassionate interrogation of postmodern America. Because it would seem that there's such a similarity in the two most recent hits we got in title, I'm going to do something which will be important as you move through the research process, which is to look at the works cited pages for these writers, or their bibliographies. So I'm going to skip down to the end here. Much as I ask you to build a works cited page, and for the research essay, we're doing an actual annotated bibliography. But just for the purpose of demonstration here, these are all the different works that Miller is citing in his essay, and they're alphabetized. So if we go down here, if we're just kind of perusing them, we see a familiar name, the David Rando, George Saunders, and the postmodern working class. So what that tells me is that, I mean, this should be a good feeling. As I said earlier, if in your, preliminary, like, searching for sources, you run into, like, similar keywords or similar concepts that you've kind of stashed in your own notes, it shouldn't be a situation where you say, oh, I can't write about this because someone else has done that. The opposite feeling, I think, should prevail, which is, oh, I must be on the right track because these seem like at least relatively like similar ideas to some things that maybe ideas that you had but hadn't fully expressed yet. So a source that we've already encountered is something that Miller is using to build his argument there, which we can kind of zoom in on a little bit, right? So something that Miller points out in his first page, right, that he says in this opening line that George Saunders was giving a commencement address and kind of making this speech to these college graduates about, the quote is, confusion in each of us, a sickness of selfishness. And he recommended combating this malady by resolving to err in the direction of kindness, which is, of course, where part of the title of this essay comes from. And what Miller goes on to say in very nice sort of like essay writing fashion, with his thesis statement being kind of obvious in this first paragraph, he says that by underscoring the value of selflessness as well as the hazards of selfishness, the address articulated one of the guiding philosophies that has shaped its author's approach to reading and representing American culture over the last 2 decades. Phrased another way, he's saying that in Saunders' work, that there is this guiding philosophy of erring in the direction of kindness or compassion, or the word we used before, empathy, right? So I don't really think that there's going to be a lot of conflict necessarily between what we've pointed out so far and what any of these scholars have been pointing out. They may phrase it in what seems more complex language, but nevertheless, I think that nothing that we've encountered thus far is really contradicting any of the notes that we made as a class, right? That that Saunders is writing about marginalized characters and that they seem to be kind of on the fringes of their respective, social formations, that empathy or kindness seems to be a quality that is important to Saunders as a writer. And this question of like his larger project, right, could be any real combination of these things. So far, all of the writers we've looked at in the database so far insist that there is something inherently postmodern about Saunders's work. And that's something that I would rather leave to those of you who are choosing to write about Saunders to unpack for yourself. It may be a bit beyond the scope of this video right now, but I would say just take a crack at it and see if you can find a source that can give you a literary definition of postmodernism there, and then come back to me when you've decided on your research essay proposal, which we're going to do over email, and we'll have a little bit of a back and forth over what some of these writers may mean by that, and maybe more importantly what they don't mean by that. But as I close out this video, I want to emphasize, as I've been doing the past minute or so, that even just our like basic kind of back of the envelope notes about this one single story by Saunders seem to match up like fairly well with what some of these scholars have been saying about not just that one story, but about his work as a whole, right? So go forward with I hope, with the knowledge that it's highly unlikely that whatever your kind of sense of what a work is about or what this larger project that a writer may be putting forward is going to be wildly different than some kind of like scholarly consensus. Of course, there will times when scholars disagree with one another. We've already seen that in class, but I think looking at these like short pieces by Saunders and comparing them with what we see so far in the databases is a good sort of first step exercise in like, well, how do we screen information? We may not understand everything we read in every sentence of every academic essay. I think maybe the most important lesson of the research essay and the research process is learning how to like kind of, I wouldn't use the word skim necessarily, but how to read a work where you're not necessarily understanding 100% what the writer is saying, but that that there's something in there that can be useful to your analysis. I mean, if we never push ourselves, we never learn anything new, right? And, a writer like Miller may be using a terminology that's unfamiliar to a lot of us, but I guarantee you that by the end of, their essays, you're going to have a better handle on what they're talking about, and hopefully have a better handle on the work of the writer that you chose to analyze. And you might even find that these unfamiliar terms become part of your own vocabulary and kind of amplify your ability to say what we were already kind of saying in our class notes. So with that, I think I'll end this particular video, but there will be more forthcoming. And as always, if you have any questions about what I've discussed here, please either email me or post about them in the Q&A updates doc. All right. I hope you all are having a good weekend, and take care.